Hello, this is the second in a series of videos about the emergence of the British anti-slavery movement. In it, I will describe the formation of the British Abolitionist Society and the initial development of the abolitionist movement. Before I begin, let me make three general points. Firstly, the movement in Britain to abolish slavery and the slave trade became a significant force during the late 18th century, developing into a mass movement which pioneered many of the techniques of modern non-governmental organizations and profoundly changed public sensibility, as well as leading to the eventual abolition of both the slave trade and British Caribbean slavery. Secondly, I would argue that one of the major reasons for the movement's success was that it was strongly rooted in religious sensibilities. Fundamental to its success in Britain was its promotion by religious activists, initially Quakers and Anglican evangelicals, who formed its core group. In this, there was an obvious contrast with the French abolitionist movement, which started at about the same time as the British movement, but was not very successful. There are various reasons for the French movement's lack of success, including the complex developments of the French Revolution, but one of the most important was its lack of a religious base. Those who supported French abolitionism were mostly Enlightenment liberals, and they failed to create a popular mass base, a quite different situation to that of the British movement. Thirdly, there is a difference in usage of the word abolitionism between British and American contexts. In Britain it came to refer to abolition of either the slave trade, slavery, or both, whilst in the United States it normally referred only to the abolition of slavery. The development of the anti-slavery movement effectively began on the 22nd of May 1787 in a printer's shop near Lombard Street in the City of London. Thomas-Clarkson had been personally transformed by the research and thinking he had completed for his award-winning Latin essay on slavery, and decided that he was morally obligated to do something to awaken people to its evils. Going to London to find a printer for an English-language version of his essay, he met both Granville Sharp and the abolitionist Quakers. The book appeared in 1786, and in 1787 Sharp, Clarkson, and 10 others, mostly Quakers, met together and formed what soon became known as the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade, effectively the forerunner of all modern non-governmental organizations. The Abolitionist Society was the pioneer movement of social reform in the modern world. As such, it had no clear model to follow and had to develop its own objectives and methods. Let me comment briefly on four aspects of this: the establishment of objectives, organization and local activism, the work to gain a parliamentary voice, and the work to collect evidence and gain momentum. The Central Committee decided early on to focus their efforts on the slave trade rather than slavery itself, hence the name they adopted for themselves. Their reasoning here was purely practical. They correctly saw that the West Indian plantation interests were too politically influential both in Westminster and the various colonial assemblies to challenge directly. Moreover, West Indian planters could argue both that slaves were property, and that an attack on the institution was therefore an attack on property rights, and that the sugar plantations made a vital contribution to the British economy. In any case, it was anticipated that the slave traders might prove to be easier to overcome, and that cutting off the supply of slaves from Africa would in any case force the plantations to treat their existing slaves better, so that they were more likely to survive. The London Committee came to function as a coordinating centre for what rapidly became a national movement. From the beginning, the movement was characterized both by local activism and a network of local groups, initially making use of the pre-existing Quaker network to help mobilize supporters. It is of note that the movement was also well organized from the beginning, a reflection, no doubt, of the capabilities of the sort of individuals attracted to it. An early decision of the Central Organising Committee in London was to gain an abolitionist voice in Parliament. Only if Parliament was persuaded could legislation against the slave trade be passed. The committee was particularly fortunate in gaining the early support of young William Wilberforce, one of the MPs for Yorkshire, who became its powerful and effective voice in the House of Commons. I will talk more about Wilberforce in the next video. The London Committee also realized that one of its most important initial tasks was to collect evidence and so build up a solid case against the slave trade, which would be persuasive both in impacting public opinion and the crucial parliamentary campaign led by Wilberforce. Collecting evidence, mobilizing public support, and persuading Parliament were inextricably interconnected. In this endeavour, the role of Thomas-Clarkson was crucial. Only 27 years old when the Abolitionist Society was established, his dedication and youthful energy did much to dynamize the movement, and as the paid agent of the Abolitionists' Central Committee, he embarked on a series of epic journeys which eventually took him many thousands of miles throughout Britain in search of evidence against the slave trade. He was also able to gain many new supporters for the cause. His first trip in 1787 took him to the great slaving ports of Bristol and Liverpool, where he honed his skills as a researcher and what today would be described as an investigative reporter. This is the famous Seven Stars pub in Bristol, which was one of the places he visited to collect evidence. During these visits, Clarkson recorded details of the slave trade, persuaded potential witnesses to give legal testimony, measured the tiny space allocated to an individual slave on board ship, and acquired some of the paraphernalia of slave control, which he subsequently used as visual aids when he spoke about slavery. These included handcuffs, shackles, thumbscrews, and the speculum oris, a device for opening a slave's mouth so that he or she could be forcibly fed. He also confirmed his belief that it was not just slaves who suffered from the slave trade, but also the slave ship crews themselves, who were often exploited and abused by their captains, who could cheat them out of their wages and subject them to unusually brutal punishments if they did not comply with their wishes. He noted both the brutalizing impact of the trade on its participants and the high death rates which the crews suffered from during the voyages, both important elements in the narrative that the abolitionists were now developing about the trade. Clarkson also encountered understandable opposition from those who profited from the trade. Alerted to his activities, slave ship captains and mates became hostile. He received threats, and in Liverpool he survived what appeared to have been an attempt on his life. Unwilling to accept any injustice, he went out to a ship after it had sailed in order to rescue a mate who was being held against his will, and took unsuccessful legal action against those accused of killing seamen. A second tour in 1789 produced a diagram of a fully laden slave ship, The-Brookes, with the bodies of 782 slaves shown packed together like sardines in a can. This became a vivid political graphic that was reproduced in newspapers, magazines, pamphlets, and posters, and did much to publicize the abolitionist case. I should note in passing that the diagram showed The-Brookes when it was relatively lightly loaded. Tight packing captains, as they were called, on the same ship, had previously crammed 609 and even 749 slaves into the same space. Meanwhile, abolitionism was emerging as a large-scale public movement, with hundreds or possibly thousands of activists and eventually at least 1/3 supporters. This was remarkable. Supporters of the abolitionists included Britain's tiny black community, itself comprising many former slaves, but the overwhelming majority of supporters were ordinary white Britons of a variety of social classes who had no immediate contact with the Caribbean or Africa, and yet had come to feel sympathy with the plight of the slaves. I will need to speculate as to why this may have been in a later supplementary video, But for the moment, let me merely echo Granville Sharp, who hopefully opined at the start of the abolitionist campaign that the nature of the slave trade needed only to be known to be detested. Activities during these years could be initiated both by the London Committee or the various local groups. The Central Committee started a newsletter to provide some coordination and keep supporters updated with activities, and also to make fundraising appeals. There was also increasing and effective publicity, with articles attacking the slave trade appearing in local newspapers across the country. And in a startlingly modern move, the eminent potter, Josiah-Wedgwood, a keen supporter of abolition, produced a logo showing a kneeling slave beseeching justice with the words, "Am I not a man and a brother?" which came to be displayed on leaflets and everything from plates and snuff boxes to ladies' hairpins. The abolitionists also organized public meetings, and even the non-abolitionist London debating societies began to include the issues of slavery and the slave trade as one of their most popular topics. One major activity was the organization of petitions, as local abolitionist societies, many of them spurred into action by Clarkson during his travels, became active. The Manchester Society was particularly active, with over 10,000 names, that's a fifth of the city's population of the time, being collected in a petition to Parliament, and the local committee beginning a campaign of lobbying and publicity throughout the country. By the end of the 1788 parliamentary session, 103 petitions calling for the abolition or reform of the slave trade had been received, with an estimated 60 to 100,000 signatures. And by 1792, an estimated 390,000 people had put their names to abolitionist petitions addressed to Parliament. Another tactic was a growing boycott of slave-produced Caribbean sugar, in which possibly over 500,000 Britons eventually participated in a mass action political campaign designed to put pressure on the West Indies sugar industry and its supporters. Those who joined the boycott either took sugar produced by free labor in India or did without sugar altogether, a significant sacrifice in a society which already enjoyed a high level of addiction to sugar. Several important new books related to the abolitionist cause also appeared during these years, notably John Newton's Thoughts upon the African Slave Trade in 1788, and Olaudah Equiano's The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano, or Gustavus Vasa the African, in 1789. By this time, John Newton was a popular evangelical preacher, famous for his hymns, such as Amazing Grace, now one of the most well-known English hymns in the world. But before taking up his religious vocation, Newton had been a slave ship captain, and it was his brief memoir of those former days that he now published, describing the enormous brutality of the trade and calling those slaves who fought for their freedom patriots in the cause of liberty. The second book was the autobiography of the black British writer and activist Olaudah Equiano. This was extremely well received and widely read, with many thousands of copies sold. Equiano was a pioneer of the modern writer's book tour, embarking on an extensive journey around Britain to sell copies of his book directly to the public. Large numbers of people listened to his public lectures, and the book tour itself brought home to many white Britons the injustices of slavery and of the slave trade, conscious of the dignified endurance of his sufferings related by the book's author.